Thank you, Stefan. I met Stefan a few years ago in Berlin, and at the time I was with the Robert Bosch Stiftung as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow, so we were talking about coming to this conference, and it's taken a couple of years, but I'm really glad to see it. If you want a case study of effective leadership, look around you, because this is the power of vision, and quite truly. But the other secret to leadership that I've discovered is surround yourself with good people, and that helps enormously as well. Now, it's self-evident to say this, but our goal in school should be student learning and achievement. But as we know, frequently that gets sidelined by other things, and we've had managerial influences at different times and corporate influences and marketing your school and being an entrepreneur and all of those sorts of things. As Stefan said, my background was a high school teacher, and I did what many people do. Towards the end of my teaching career, I enrolled in a Masters of Educational Administration, and it was a very good course, and I found it very valuable. But when I reflect back on it, in that course, teachers were rarely mentioned, teaching even less so. Students were hardly mentioned at all, and learning not at all. So one of the things that's been driving me since I began my research career was trying to connect these things up together. And a first attempt was in 2008 with this book, How to Get Your School Moving and Improving. And as I said, it arose from this particular disconnect, because I think to some degree the research literatures don't or haven't connected sufficiently. And I realised, it's one of those things you don't know what you don't know until you encounter. And I realised that if I was going to go much further with this work in terms of effective teaching and effective in schools, I needed to know more about learning. And this particular book came out last year, and it's deliberately called Leading, Learning and Teaching, not leading, teaching and learning, because the learning, the second word, applies equally to staff, students as well. It's not just a matter of working with teachers so students can learn. Professional development, professional learning is one of the most powerful drivers that we've got. In this particular book, you can see my strategy, I think. The first 8 chapters are about the research evidence on teaching for learning. And one of the reasons for that is that there is so much ideology, as we've heard, vested interests. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's ideological, sometimes it's financial, people wanting to make money out of education. So I think it's very, very important that we don't waste our time, our money and our students' welfare on strategies that are not effective. And then you can see there the process of thought. Just going back in time a little bit, our views in schools up to, say, the mid-60s or beyond the mid-60s even, was that we couldn't make much difference to students. It was down to their, what they could achieve was down to things like their social economic background, their parents, their race, their culture, the part of the city they lived in, all of those sorts of things. And measured IQ was seen to be fixed almost at birth or shortly afterwards. So the most we could do is get people up to some sort of predetermined level and send them on their way. And schooling was organised along those lines to some degree. Now, in the post-World War II period, there was a heavy investment in education in many countries, and it was seen as a means of personal, social and economic development and achievement and prosperity. But when we started to look at very similar schools, they might have been similar in terms of the clientele, the area that they were in, the resources, the curriculum, the staffing. Some schools were much more effective than others, and as a result we started looking at some of the more intangibles, not just the structural. We have a tendency in education when we want to improve, we go to structure, and that's not always the best way to go. Subsequently, after our work on looking at effective principals, for example, and superintendents and so on, we really came down to the conclusion that it's the teacher, the biggest in-school influence on student achievement. Not the biggest, but the biggest in-school influence, accounting for about 30% of the variance, according to Hattie. So as a result, there's been a major international emphasis on improving the quality of teaching since the mid-80s, and a succession of influential OECD reports. And I put it to you now, we've got a pretty good idea how teacher expertise develops. We've got a pretty good idea what good teaching looks like. And in fact, we have a good idea what good leadership and even good schools look like. Our biggest problem is variation. A quality teacher in every classroom is the ultimate aim, but how to achieve that's the big question. So it isn't so much identifying and describing quality teaching. I think we've done that fairly well. It's as we said in our report for the Business Council of Australia in 2008, is to make best practice common practice, to close that variation gap. Now, one of the key questions is, what is teaching? And Dominic talked about technology and so forth. Thomas Edison in 1877 invented the phonograph, and he predicted that we wouldn't need teachers anymore. We'd only need one good teacher, if you like. We could make a recording of that person. And if our conception of teaching was transmission of knowledge, then he might have been onto something. But we have the internet, and everything's out there, so we don't need teachers anymore. We need guides by the side and facilitators. My argument's the reverse of that. In the current situation, we need good teachers more than ever, and we need teachers who are trained and understand the affordances from the technology. One of the things that concerns me, I think, is the technology has raced ahead of the pedagogy, and we're drastically trying to close that gap. Now, Bill Gates has got a vested interest, but even he can see the sense in that, I think. Now, early on, I did a lot of work involved observations of teachers who'd been identified as being really effective in classrooms and so on. And I continued that, looking at effective faculties and departments in schools and effective schools, both in Australia and overseas, including in my fellowship in Germany. And I developed a very simple model towards the end of the 2008 book, which actually forms the beginning of the 2016 book. So what do you see in effective classrooms, faculties and departments, schools and even systems? There is a central focus on the student. We know students as learners, but we also know them as people. And some schools get that balance wrong. They either focus entirely on the learning side, or often in low SES schools, they focus on the person side. How do we know them as a learner? We know them through assessment in its broadest sense, not just standardised tests, but assessing on a daily basis how they're going, where they've been, where they are, what they need to do to improve. Then we can personalise through feedback and instruction what they need. But the person side's also important too. The relationship, for example, between teachers and students is known to have a large effect size. When we ask students around the world, and I've done this, what do you want from your teachers? I get the same two answers all the time. The language varies and the wording sometimes, but the two things students want. They want teachers who care and teachers who are fair. And the caring includes academic, but it also includes the personal, and it also includes the social aspects as well. The fairness, obviously, is the whole issue of being treated fairly, and students and young people generally have an expression, that's not fair. Now, they have a very finely tuned radar when it comes to fairness, so it's got big implications for us in terms of diversity and acceptance of people who are maybe different from us. So that's our central focus. Every student is known as a learner and a person. What else do we see? We see leadership as being one of the big enablers. Now, it's not just people in formal leadership positions, because every teacher's a leader. When a teacher takes their class, they're leading. If they take a sporting group, a music group, a cultural group, when they sit on an ICT committee, a student welfare committee, that's all leadership. Leadership makes a school effective. You can have good teaching without having a good school. I don't think you can have a good school without good leadership, and that means everybody contributing to that. What else do we see? We see professional learning. One of the very large effect sizes, as we know. I don't think we can change or improve a school without professional learning. And that means changing what teachers know and can do, but in some cases what they value, what their principles are. We have to challenge those sometimes. And we see, surprisingly, quality teaching. And there are two sides to the quality teaching coin. There is the quality of the teacher, their capabilities and so forth, their suitability for teaching, and there's the quality of their teaching, which is the impact they have on student learning and development. It's a simple model. Now, what about socioeconomic status? Because for some people, this is everything. It's just too hard. It's a mountain that's too hard to climb. What do we know about it? Well, SES and home environment both have an effect size of around about 0.52 according to most of the studies. We have to differentiate because some homes are, let's say, a low SES school, which is incredibly supportive and caring, but you also get a high SES school, high SES home, I should say, which is basically dysfunctional. So some kids get a double whammy there. They get the low SES and they get the poor home environment. So what do we know about it? It is about these things. It's about foundations and advantage, both the social capital and the financial capital that comes with it. It's about support, it's about role models and encouragement. And if you're the first member of your family to go past a very minimal level of education, it's unknown territory. So it is about those things. But it's not about these things. It's not about innate ability. There was a belief, as I mentioned earlier, that IQ is sort of fixed at birth and that there's not much we can do about that. And that it's the second point there about social biological determinism I'll come back to. During the and you understand the concept of IQ and the normal curve and the average being 100. During the 20th century, IQ scores kept increasing and they had to renorm the tests a number of times to bring the average back to 100. A child today who has an IQ score of 100 would have had 125, 130 at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a fellow called James Flynn, who's an American psychologist who lives in New Zealand, and he identified a phenomenon which has become known as the Flynn effect, which is about this incremental increases in IQ. Now, what's behind it? Well, if you look at the 20th century, there were all sorts of advances in medicine and everything else. There were also depressions and wars and one thing and another. The main factor responsible for increased IQ scores during the 20th century was more people went to school and for longer. And the longer part's important too. This is a radical thought, but schooling makes people smarter. Now, there is a sting in the tail because there's a couple of very large countries that I won't name where the Flynn effect is now starting to go into reverse. And when the Flynn effect goes into reverse, people start pointing the finger. And the usual answer is, that's the migrants. It's not. It's been what's been happening to public education. Now, the social biological determinism, people have attempted at different times to say that certain cultural, racial, ethnic groups are superior, inferior to another. In any group of people, whether they be Ethiopians or Eskimos or any other group that you can think of that starts with the letter E, you get the same spread of ability. Yes, it's true that some of the tests are culturally biased and people have certain disadvantages, and there is an effect associated with SES, but it's not a life sentence. Very important fact about IQ. Intelligence doesn't predict what someone can learn. What it does predict often is how quickly they can learn it. It is possible to teach almost anybody, almost anything with good teaching. But for some people it takes a bit longer. And there's a very big implication there about expecting everybody to be at the same point on the continuum at any one point in time. There's a big, thank you. There's a big implication about not giving up on people. And there's a final point about IQ too. I hesitate to use the word in this current context, but knowledge trumps IQ. And I'll demonstrate this to you. Think back to it, many of you would have been teachers, obviously. When you began your teaching career, what knowledge did you have? Now, your IQ is probably similar to what it was when you started. Maybe it's a little bit less, who knows? The fact is your knowledge now is substantial in terms of what it was when you began your career. So knowledge trumps IQ. It's not about potential. Yes, life isn't fair, and we have to deal with that. But good teaching, good schools are the best means we have of overcoming the effects of disadvantage and opening the doors of opportunity for young people. Now, we have to really challenge in our schools some of the assumptions that people make. This is a working class school in a working class area. Don't expect too much and you won't be disappointed. Low expectations is a killer because we have that same spread of ability, but often that spread of ability is hidden by people's backgrounds. When we try and make sense of the world, one of the things we often do is to put things into categories. It makes it easier to deal with. However, when we're talking about students, when we're talking about young people, when we're talking about people generally, putting them into categories is a very, very bad idea because what tends to happen is they see those categories as fixed and a statement, a judgment about them, and I'll come back to that point. Here's an interesting case I saw in England. I was doing some talks in 2011 and just picked this up from the Daily Mail. You can't read the fine print, but the thrust of the argument is this particular school is losing students to other schools that are seen to have higher status, more elite, nice uniforms, good peer group, all those sorts of things. So this principal has a wonderful idea. Let's divide our school into three. The bright kids, the ones in the middle and the ones at the bottom. The bright kids will feel better about themselves. They'll have a special uniform. That'll be something to aspire to. The ones in the middle, well, they can try and go to the top. The ones at the bottom, well, they've got an incentive to try and climb that ladder as well. And the parents will like to keep those children in that school now because it's a different sort of... You can see there's about 10 things wrong with that argument. Now, Carol Dweck has done some very important work about how we think about our own abilities. And the issue of seeing your ability as fixed or getting a message that your ability is fixed is central to this. She identified a number of harmful and invalid beliefs in schooling. Students with high ability are more likely to display that. No, they're not in many cases. We haven't identified them, or we've made up our minds about them early on, they're not so bright. Success in school directly fosters that. Not in many cases, it doesn't. We actually hinder, dampen down, turn people off. Praise, we'll have a look at that in a moment, and confidence in their own intelligence. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Getting back to entity thinking. If we divided the room into two and we gave you a task to do and you all did it, which would be wonderful, and I said to one half of the room, you must be really bright to have done that, you're smart, you're a natural, you're gifted. And I say to the people on this side of the room, you must have worked really hard to solve that problem. The way you've worked that out, that's really impressive. You know, well done. It wasn't easy, but you did it. Which group does best next time? The ones who were told they were bright or the ones who were told they worked hard? The people who were told they worked hard every time. Because the people who were told they were bright, a little switch goes on in their head. I'm bright. Responsibility for my learning now passes to somebody else. They have to recognise I'm bright and do something with it. The people on this side of the room have got what we call a growth mindset. They've been given a message, effort brings reward. And that's what we want to do with kids. Because when we give them a view of their abilities as being fixed, either you're good at something or you're no good at something, it's powerful all the way down the line. Now, there's a lot of rubbish written about learning. There's a lot of people trying to make money. If somebody offers you a quick fix solution to improve your student results overnight, be very, very careful. Now, there's a group called Deans for Impact in the US, and they came up with something in 2015. Deans from different discipline backgrounds they call it the science of learning. And it's terrific because it's a really good summary, I think, of some of the essentials about what we know about learning. So how do you learn new ideas? Well, we have to help them make reference to what they already know. We have to connect the learning in their experience. If we give students a whole lot of fragmented, disconnected things to learn, and we don't work with them to understand how it fits together and why it's important, they won't learn it. Surprise, surprise. So there's an issue of memory which is really important. Working memory, short-term memory versus long-term memory. How many people here can remember their first day of primary school? High school? Can you remember what you had for dinner last Tuesday last week? One of the things about memory is meaning. We have to help students understand. Now, some things have meaning to us personally, like our birthday or a particular anniversary or something of that nature. So there's personal meaning, but there's also meaning more generally. We have to help people understand the meaning of things. Now, if you can remember what you had for dinner Tuesday last week, it might have been because it was a special occasion. One of the things we need to do with students is make learning a special occasion. Now, the second point there is, and about the limited working capacity I should mention too, we need to get things into long-term memory so that they can be taken out and used again. And getting things into long-term memory is quite a challenge. The idea of cognitive development going through a fixed sequence of age-related stages, all I'll say simply is Piaget was wrong and Vygotsky was right. Now, what about new information? Well, as I've said there, we want them to remember it, but we have to help them by connecting, and we have to help them understand about the meaning behind what they're doing and what they're encountering. Now, practice is essential to that, and practice accompanied with feedback, but not all practice is equivalent, as we'll see. So how do you solve problems? Well, you need a certain amount of factual material. There is a view, it's an ideological view, it would be better if students could teach themselves what they needed to know. They wouldn't have to, have an expert teacher help them and so forth. Go to any traditional society in the world anywhere and you'll look at how people learn. They learn through initially watching, and then someone shows them how to do something, they get a bit of practice at it, they get some feedback, and on they go. We don't say to them, you're a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old boy, it's about time you learnt to be a hunter and gatherer, off you go into the desert to teach yourself. It'll be better if you can teach yourself, it'll be quite an accomplishment. So getting those facts and understandings into long-term memory that can then be applied for problem solving, can then be applied to work on projects is quite important. And as I've mentioned, their feedback's quite essential to that. Now, one of the ways we can then use that information is through connecting up to different sorts of case studies and examples. For example, we might study agriculture in Switzerland in some depth, and as part of that study we'll develop certain understandings and factual knowledge and concepts and so forth that can then be applied to look at farming, agriculture in South America, for example. But we have to help the students understand what's underlying those examples, why they're doing them. If I could ban anything in the world, well, almost anything, I would ban the downloadable worksheet that someone just downloads, gives to their students without the proper introduction, the proper scaffolding, and often without the proper feedback. Now, motivation. When people tell us we have to do something, the usual response is, do the minimum to get them off my back. What we call satisficing behaviour in organisational psychology. It's limited. But when people want to learn, want to do something, either as an individual or as a group, it's almost open-ended in terms of what can be achieved. The mistake a lot of people have made with learning is we have to get students engaged, we have to make it fun, we have to dumb it down and make it easy. The best teachers, and I've been studying effective teachers for a long time, the best teachers don't dumb down. They make those connections we talk about. They make it relevant to students through the examples, the case studies and so forth. Things that we get really easily don't help us much and don't contribute much to things like resilience. So if we can get them really interested in what they're doing and seeing the connections and seeing the importance, that self-determined motivation is far more powerful. Monitoring your own thinking through things like metacognition, helping students do that, judging how they're going is also important. And that last point there is tied in with the care and fair. When they believe they belong and they're accepted. Now, some of the misconceptions about learning, there aren't different learning styles, and if I had the time I'd take that one apart, but it's pervasive, it's still there, the idea that people are hardwired. This business that we only use 10% of our brain, somebody made that figure up. There's no proof, there's no evidence for it. The right brain, left brain stuff, putting people into two categories, supposedly based upon which side of the brain they supposedly use. I'm sorry, there's no evidence for that. We know that different parts of the brain assume functions for certain things, but we also know that when people have catastrophic brain injury, the brain reworks and rewires itself to take that into the same, perform the same functions. Novices and experts don't think in the same ways. A novice teacher doesn't think in the same way as an expert teacher. There was a couple of fellows called the Dreyfus brothers in California in the 70s that did some 60s and 70s did work on experts. And they looked at expertness in things like flying a plane, playing chess, being a musician, and so forth. And what they found was that the learning needs of people as a novice are quite different to when they are an expert. Novices need a lot of supervision, support, instruction, feedback on a fairly regular basis. Experts, less so. It's a mistake to treat a novice like an expert. It's a mistake to treat an expert like a novice, but often we make that mistake. And then that second point there about there aren't fixed age-related stages. We can accelerate the process and we can de-accelerate it as well. Now, what about self-esteem and this notion that we can make people feel good about themselves, it'll be more effective for their learning? The mistake we've made here is that, yes, there is a moderate effect size for self-concept or self-esteem, how you feel about yourself and what you can do. But the mistake we've made is to think, well, if we can boost self-esteem or self-concept, that will lead to even greater learning. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It gives people a false impression, it confuses them, they never receive a failing mark. The thing about failure is if it's handled in the right way, it can be effective and powerful for learning. And once you finally overcome that and you succeed in reaching the standard, you feel a lot better about yourself. Giving people only positive feedback, giving them praise rather than feedback which is helpful, all problematic. We don't give people self-esteem. If they can experience success, even if it's only in small steps, if they can feel themselves getting better and achieving more, that feeds into self-esteem, that feeds into self-concept, that feeds into greater achievement. Now, constructivism. The Deans for Impact framework that I gave you is really about constructivism. Constructivism is how we make sense of the world on a daily basis, how we process new information, how we make those changes in our long-term memory, how we deepen our understanding, how we see how things fit together. The mistake with constructivism is it's been, like many things, distorted to mean people teaching themselves, constructing their own learning, or social constructivism, working together to teach themselves something they don't know. And even one step further, using their hands, literally constructing. And this was from Mayer and the American psychologist. And just to cut to the chase, the formula constructivism equals hands-on activity is a formula for disaster. Now, I talked about practice. Spaced practice, and this was developed by a German psychologist in 1895, and I'll come back to that point later. But if you can come back several times with students and reinforce and revise what's been done, you'll have a much better effect in terms of the effect on learning. The effect size is 0.71, which is in the large to very large category. Mass practice means we do it once, we forget it, we move on. Now, some people are ideologically opposed to practice, which is a very curious concept. The components of deliberate practice, performance based upon a particular element of the task. What this means is if you're a soccer coach, you coach a soccer team, you don't practice soccer by playing soccer. You isolate the various skills and things that you want to work on. How do we defend corners? How do we do this? How do we do that? Whatever it happens to be. Expert coaching, feedback. Now, feedback has two functions, judgment and development. And often it's just on the judgment side, it's not the development side, so it needs both of those things. And the opportunity to apply feedback immediately for improved performance. Now, let's go back to 1885, Hermann Ebbinghaus. This is held up remarkably well. What it basically shows us is that if we learn something today, we first learn it and we have 100% recall or understanding. Within 3 days, maybe, we've retained about 60%. And so it goes down the line. But if we can have several instances fairly close together of review and revision and practice and feedback, then our chances of retaining that information are much better. So when it comes to student learning, there is a magic number. And the magic number is 3. And if we can give people 3 opportunities to practice, get feedback, revise, there's a better chance that it will stick. And I'm not advocating that we triple the length of time people spend in schooling. Feedback. As I mentioned, feedback has 2 purposes. One is judgmental and one is developmental, and often we neglect that. The problem is when students don't receive feedback, they can be disillusioned, they can quit, they can be frustrated. It's much easier to teach people how to do something correctly the first time than to try and remediate later on because they've learnt the wrong things. Now, in my experience, students need, and in fact we all do, need answers to 4 questions. What can I do at the present time, keeping in mind the dangers of entity thinking? The key thing when we're talking to students about how they're going is to focus on their performance, not the person. It's their performance at this particular time in Year 8 mathematics or whatever it happens to be. And at the present time, what is it that they're struggling with? And sometimes that's where our assessment stops because there's no real feedback, it's just assessment. This one, though, is more helpful. It's about the standard that's expected. This one is the powerful one. How can I do better? and that's the one that they rarely get. Our feedback needs to be both judgmental and developmental, and it needs to be personalised. It needs to be based upon the performance of the individual student. This is a quote from a 14-year-old student. You don't know what you're supposed to do to get any better. And I'm just going to finish with some quotes on leadership and learning, because my thesis basically is that leaders in schools such as principals and assistant principals and heads of departments and so on need to have this knowledge of learning and teaching. And if they're not doing that, they're simply administering or managing. And I'm fully aware of the difficulties of balancing those two things. We've moved beyond the notion that the principal is the only leader. Leadership is working with and through other people. Increasingly, we're interested in the impact now. We don't just want to know that we've done something, we want to know that it's worked and the degree to which it's worked and the reasons why it may not have worked. And there's a pretty substantial body of research now on instructional leadership as opposed to other forms. We often restructure, and we think that's going to solve our problems. We structure the length of the day, how the school's organised and so forth. Vivienne Robinson and co. Core business of teaching and learning, greater influence on student outcomes. Now, the issue for leaders, of course, is how do you penetrate that classroom door? You can't be in every classroom, you can't be giving teachers individual feedback and so forth. That's the real dilemma. Now, in the book I go further and we look at various projects that we've been involved with where people have taken that active instructional leadership role. They've seen teaching and learning being the prime focus of the school. They've used professional learning of staff. They've identified school priorities for professional learning based upon the needs of students, not just the teachers or the system. And they've worked through a process of renewal and change, and you don't do it on your own, you do it with other people. And the turnaround schools that I've been working with, both here and elsewhere, also I want to say here, I'm thinking I'm in Australia, that's just jet lag. The average time that we've seen to turn a school around is 6 to 7 years. That's going from a school that's going right down, coming up the other side, and getting to a point where it hopefully will be sustainable. So yes, you can get some quick wins, you can get some quick fixes, but it's substantial work and you need to work through a whole range of things as an instructional leader to get to where you want to go. And at that point, I will thank you and conclude.